Chag Sameach! How's everybody doing? What a great day! That was Moshe Storch singing Hallel on Hoshana Rabbah, but not the recording that we've been listening to during the 2-minute intro for the last 2 or 3 years. That's from this morning. And actually, I did post. I went live on the Instagram, Accidental Talmudist on Instagram. So if you'd like to experience some or all of that, the video is all there. Really, it was such a beautiful musical Hallel. Took us to another place. Moshe was very generous. I asked him to use that Baruch Chait melody. When we get to the line in Psalm 118, open the gates of justice and the righteous shall enter. It was just something, we just went up and up and up. I was so moved, and I'm sure that part of the emotion of the day, of course, was that the hostages are free. I think all the living hostages have been returned, and please, the remains should come home soon, if not already. Amazing, right? Incredible timing that God arranged for all this. They were taken so in Israel, Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, which is its own holiday after the 7 days of Sukkot. The 8th day is called Shmini Atzeret, and that's the 8th day of assembly. Like I said, it's its own holiday. In Israel, that is the same day as Simchas Torah. And that was the day, October 7th, when the hostages were taken 2 years ago. Outside of Israel, Shmini Atzeret is a 2-day holiday, and so Simchas Torah is celebrated on the 2nd day. So what does that mean? That means that in Israel, the war ended and the hostages were returned. If you haven't seen these reunion videos of the hostages coming home and being reunited with their parents, with their spouses, with their loved ones, I mean, if you want to cry for joy, that's a way to do it. And so they're all back, and it's like God gave us to reclaim the joy. Simchat Torah means the joy of Torah. And so he gave us to reclaim the joy of Simchas Torah, which, when that tragedy, that debacle, that violence, that assault, that hostage taking, it all happened in Israel on Simchas Torah. It was also Shmini Atzeret, and is also Shabbos on October 7th in 2023. But today, on Hoshana Rabbah, is when the hostages were returned, and so that lets in Israel, which Simchas Torah has already begun, Shmini Atzeret / Simchas Torah has already begun in Israel, and so they're in just full simcha mode, right? Full joy mode. Thank God. Thank you, HaShem. Let's light up the darkness. Thank you, HaShem. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm definitely high on HaShem right now. I'm high on God, and and I just wanted to bring back some of that feeling, that It's an old saying. I don't even know where that saying first comes from, to bring fire back from the mountain. I don't think it's in the Bible, although it's implied by the mountain shook like a furnace, right, at Mount Sinai when the Torah was given. Maybe that's the original reference. It should be if it isn't. But yeah, anyway, I wanted to bring fire back from the mountain today. So we're going to learn some beautiful Torah. We're still doing some technical stuff about disqualified offerings when the temple stood. But let's see if together we can, pierce the technicalities of it and get to the underlying spirituality of it. This is all of Sukkot, right? Is the season of rejoicing. It's Siman Simchasenu, right? Literally the season of rejoicing. That's the name of Sukkot. So who's in the house with us celebrating today? Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Gordo in Scotland. What a morning, what a day, says Gordo. Nancy in North Carolina, Belle in Texas, Karen in Northern California, Nans in Tucson, Arizona, Lorraine in Texas, Yehuda in South Carolina, Celeste. Am Yisrael Chai, says Celeste. From Colorado, Nancy's still at work. Mickey in Vineland, New Jersey. Annette in Fort Lauderdale. Lester in Spring Valley. Ella in Southern California. Marie in Freeport, New York. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 27, and we're about 40% of the way down, page 27a. Continue our discussion of Mishnah number 2, which with God's help we're going to complete. Mishnah number 3, which today, are we going to complete it and go to Mishnah 4 today? Yeah, and with God's help we'll complete Mishnah 3 and move into Mishnah 4 today. Here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. So here in chapter 2, we've been talking about matters which disqualify an offering because the priest himself is unfit, or there's something about him. He's tameh, he didn't wash his hands or feet. He was sitting instead of standing. He didn't have his feet on the floor, which could disqualify an offering that he is bringing. Now we've been talking about if he placed the blood of the offering in the wrong place, right? If he placed it in the wrong place. Very interesting, since the Torah says explicitly that when the offering is brought, it's slaughtered, and then his blood has to be sprinkled on the altar. Now, there are correct locations on the altar for him to do that. But if the blood makes it to the altar, it would appear that the offering now effects atonement for the owner, the one who was bringing it. If it was a sin offering, for example, he gets the atonement of his sin offering. But because the blood was placed in the wrong location, the edible portions are now not permitted for consumption. The priest will not eat of the sin offering, or the owner will not eat of the peace offering if the blood was sprinkled in the wrong location, right? That's a general idea we're exploring now. Okay, so the Gemara cites additional opinions with regard to the statement of the Mishnah that blood misapplied on the altar, right, wrong location on the altar, disqualifies the offering. Here, where disqualifies means it still affects atonement in most cases, but it does not permit the meat for consumption, which would include if it's an elevation offering, which is entirely consumed on the altar. If the blood was misapplied, now it doesn't get burned on the altar because the blood was misapplied. Therefore, not permitted for consumption even by the altar, not only just by people. But as we'll see, if they erroneously then put the meat on the altar, we don't take it down, because in matters of holiness, we ascend, please God, and we don't descend. Reish Lakish says, actually, when the Mishnah states that the offering is disqualified, this is to be taken literally, i.e. that the owner does not even achieve atonement through it, right? Contrary to what we've learned before. And nevertheless, blood sprinkled not in its proper place is considered as though it were sprinkled in its proper place. Therefore, it does affect atonement. What? And the apparent contradiction between these two claims is not difficult. Here, where the misapplication of the blood effects atonement, it is a case where he placed it in silence, i.e. without specific intent. There, in the Mishnah, it is a case where he placed it with a statement, i.e. intent to consume the offering beyond its appointed time. Right? So not whether he placed it on the altar in the wrong place, or perhaps that he had intent to do something else wrong in the process, but he didn't say anything, as opposed to he had an intent at the time of sprinkling to do something else wrong, like eating the meat beyond its allotted time, and he verbalized that intent. Now the meat will not be permitted for consumption even during its allowed time. Since Reish Lakish agrees with the statement of Shmuel that blood applied not in its proper place is considered as though it were applied in its proper place, the Gemara poses the same difficulties to the statement of Reish Lakish as was posed above yesterday to Shmuel. We learned in a Baraisa, if one slaughtered an offering and he had intent to place the blood, right? He had intent at the time of slaughter to place the blood in the wrong location on the altar. So blood that is to be placed below the red line, he had intent to place it above the red line at the time of slaughter. Or blood that is to be placed above the red line, he had intent to place it below the red line. Until the response of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, we had this contradiction, and then he said, well, just as the case is with regard to the intent to leave portions of the offering for the next day, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, etc., the way we resolved it yesterday. So Rabbi Yochanan says, both here and there, i.e. in the Mishnah here as well as in the Mishnah there in chapter 32a, in the next chapter on page 32a, it is a case where he placed the blood in silence. And the Mishnah here rules that the offering is completely disqualified because blood applied not in its proper place is not considered as though it were applied in its proper place if he verbalized the inappropriate intent. And that Mishnah in the next chapter, which states that the blood may be collected and sprinkled again, is referring to a case where blood of the soul, right, the blood that gushes out at the time of slaughter with the animal bleeding out, that's the blood of the soul, and where there is blood of the soul left in the animal to sprinkle again, right, when it was applied improperly, so then, is it over? No, because if there's some of the blood of the soul left, even though it was done improperly, you can get a do-over, but only in certain situations. While this Mishnah is referring to a case where there is no blood of the soul left, so it can't be redone, there's no blood of the soul left. The Gemara challenges, we learned in the Mishnah that if the blood was misapplied on the altar, the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares for one who partakes of the meat. That's going to be distinguished from pigul, right? In a case of pigul, where, for example, the priest had at the time of slaughter intent to eat the meat of a sin offering beyond its allotted time, now he's rendered it pigul, and if he then eats the meat anyway, that is a kares-bearing offense, death at the hands of the heavenly court. Whereas sometimes you can render something disqualified and you're not allowed to eat it, but it's a kind of lesser violation of the prohibition because it was a lighter kind of inappropriate intent than pigul, and therefore if he then did eat it, he violated a prohibition, but he's not liable to kares. The Gemara challenges, we learn in the Mishnah that if the blood was misapplied on the altar, the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares to the one who partakes of the meat. Granted, according to Reish Lakish, who explains that the Mishnah is referring to one who expressed intent to sacrifice or consume the offering beyond its designated time. This is the reason that the Tana teaches disqualified, but there is no liability for kares, for burning or partaking of it, to stress that although one sprinkled the blood with intent of pigul, which would create kares, why didn't it? Because the sprinkling was performed improperly. Right? There were two issues. He had a pigul intent, but he also sprinkled it improperly. Because he sprinkled it improperly, the meat would have never become available for eating. Since the meat would have never been permitted for eating, the fact that he had a pigul intent doesn't take hold, and therefore if he did eat the meat, it wouldn't be a kares penalty. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, who explains that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the blood was sprinkled with no specific intent, Then, of what necessity is the clause, there is no liability for kares for burning or partaking it, since the offering is disqualified because the blood was placed not in its proper place, and there was no intent of pigul, why would one think that there should be a liability for kares? And the Gemara responds, that is indeed difficult for Rabbi Yochanan. His analysis has a flaw in it. So the Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, of what necessity is the clause? There is no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. So if you're saying that the analysis of Rabbi Yochanan is wrong, well, how does it work for Shmuel? This is what the Mishna is saying. If one placed the blood improperly, with intent that would otherwise render the offering pigul, right? Again, two errors. One is he had a pigul intent to eat the meat, or for that matter, sprinkle its blood beyond the allotted time. That would create pigul. But it was also sprinkled improperly, which would, sort of take pigul off the table because of this other error. So when you have those two errors, that's why the offering is disqualified, but there's no liability for kares for burning and partaking of it, because the pigul doesn't take hold because of the improper sprinkling. So the Gemara challenges, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, if blood sprinkled not in its proper place is not considered as though it were in its proper place, the fact that it is considered even though it was in the wrong place as if it were in the right place, that's what affects atonement, even though it doesn't permit consumption. But if we say no, putting it in the wrong place is not considered like putting it in the right place, even though it got to the altar, so then it should be as if it were spilled from the service vessel onto the floor. In that case, let the priest gather it up and sprinkle it again properly. Why then does the Mishnah rule that it is disqualified? Right? We saw that if the blood of the soul, right, when the animal was slaughtered, spilled on the floor, you can't then pick it up in a collection, in a service vessel, and take it to the altar for sprinkling. But if it was collected in a service vessel, and then some of it spilled on the floor, then you could pick it up off the floor, put it back in the service vessel, and sprinkle it on the altar. So what they're asking is, okay, well, you sprinkled it in the wrong place. If you can collect enough of what you sprinkled back into the service vessel and then sprinkle it in the right place. Why can't you do that? Gemara responds that the Tana, the Mishnah, holds in accordance with the opinion of one who says he may not gather it up. As Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef says, and Rabbi Yochanan says, all concede with regard to the blood that is to be placed above the red line, that if one placed it above the red line, and likewise with regard to blood that is placed below the red line, if one placed it below the red line, not in accordance with the procedure dictated by its mitzvah, for example, even though he put it in the right place, he used his left hand instead of his right hand, or he had improper intent with regard to some other aspect of the offering, then he may not gather it up again. Where they disagree is only with regard to blood that is to be placed above the red line and one placed it below, or blood that is to be placed below the red line and one placed it above the red line. As Rabbi Yosef says, he may not gather it up, but Rabbi Shimon says he may gather it up. Rabbi Shimon would give you the do-over, but Rabbi Yosef would not. 27b, and our Mishnah is in accordance with the statement of the one who says he may not gather it up, Rabbi Yosef. And Rav Chisda says that Avimi says everyone concedes with regard to the blood that is to be placed below the red line, that if one placed it above the red line, he may not gather it up again. And all the more so with regard to blood that is to be placed above the red line that one placed below the red line, since the blood placed above the red line will eventually run down the side of the altar and reach below the red line. They disagree only with regard to blood that is to be placed inside the sanctuary, that one placed on the external altar. This would be the high priest on Yom Kippur, who needs to sprinkle blood either of his own bull or of the goat that atones for the nation inside the sanctuary. Part of it goes on the golden altar, which is an incense altar, but receives a blood sprinkling on Yom Kippur. And instead, the blood that was supposed to be sprinkled on the inner altar, the golden altar, inside the sanctuary, instead he sprinkles it on the external altar, or vice versa. That's a different kind of improper application. We said there's above and below the red line. There's a correct place on the external altar, the main altar. But also if you put it on the wrong altar, instead of putting it on the external altar, you put it on the small altar, the incense altar inside the sanctuary. Here we're talking about if it was blood that was supposed to be placed. They disagree only with regard to blood that is placed inside the sanctuary, that is supposed to be placed inside the sanctuary, the Yom Kippur sprinkling, but he did it on the external altar. Or blood that is supposed to be placed outside the offering of any, the sprinkling of any altar during the year, of any offering during the year that is meant to be sprinkled on the external altar. But instead, the priest walked inside the sanctuary and sprinkled it on the incense altar, i.e. the golden altar. So both cases, wrong sprinkling. As Rabbi Yosef says, if he did that, he may gather it up, as though it had spilled on the floor. But Rabbi Shimon says he may not gather it up, because the blood was nevertheless placed on an altar. Right? So they seem to switch positions, but their logic is the same. Rabbi Shimon says once you put it on the altar, even if you put it in the wrong place, you've done it. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says you haven't done it. And that's why you could do it again. But here, where you put it on the wrong altar, it's like... Why is Rabbi Yosef saying you get... All right, because Rabbi Yosef is saying that now he says you can't gather it up because you put it on... you can't gather it up because you put it on an altar, right? He's saying an altar is an altar. Rabbi Shimon is saying... What am I saying? Because the blood was nevertheless placed on an altar is what is Rabbi Shimon's logic, right? So you're done. In other words, Rabbi Shimon is saying you're done. Rabbi Yosef is saying you placed it on the wrong altar, so you can gather up and put it on the right altar. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says we learn in a Beresa as well that if the blood is misapplied on the altar, it may not be gathered in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yehuda says that the verse states this is the law of the burnt offering, the olah, elevation offering. It is that which goes up, ha'olah, on the pyre upon the altar, Leviticus 6:2, from which it is derived that a disqualified offering that ascended upon the altar shall not descend from it. It shouldn't have gone up, but it was a disqualified offering, therefore not permitted for consumption. In the case of an olah, that means that it does not go up on the fire of the altar. But if somebody took it up there and placed it on the fire, nonetheless, in error, we don't take it off. As I mentioned before, and this is the proof text for that, these terms, i.e. this, it, and that, are three terms of exclusion, which serves to exclude three cases of disqualified offerings from this law. An offering that was slaughtered at night, one whose blood was spilled, and one whose blood emerged outside the curtains, i.e. outside the temple courtyard. In these cases, even if the offering ascended upon the altar, it shall descend, right? This is a disqualification that is severe enough that even if we put it up on the altar where normally once it ascends, it does not descend, in those cases, we have to take it off the altar. Rabbi Shimon says, from the term burnt offering, olah, I have derived only that a fit burnt offering shall not descend. From where is it derived that the law includes an offering that was slaughtered at night, or one whose blood was spilled, or one whose blood emerged outside the curtains, meaning outside the temple courtyard, or one that was left overnight, or one that left the courtyard, or one that became impure, or one that was slaughtered with intent to consume it beyond the designated time outside the designated area, or an offering for which an unfit person collected and sprinkled its blood, or a case where one placed the blood that is to be placed over the red line below it, or one placed the blood that is placed below the red line above it, or one placed the blood that is supposed to be inside the sanctuary and he placed it outside on the external altar, or one who took blood that was supposed to be on the external altar and he put it on the inside altar, or a Pesach, right, the Paschal offering, or a sin offering that one slaughtered not for their sake. From where is it derived that all these offerings, if they ascended onto the altar pyre, they shall not descend? How do we know that? The verse states, the law of the burnt offering, ha'olah, literally that which goes up. The verse included under one law all items that ascend upon the altar, teaching that if they ascended the altar, they shall not descend. One might have thought, no matter what the situation is, right, according to this view. So one might have thought that I should include even an animal that copulated with a person, God forbid, or an animal that was the object of bestiality, right? Either the giving end or the receiving end, so to speak, of bestiality, or an animal that was set aside for idolatry, or an animal that was worshipped as a deity, or an animal that was given as payment to a prostitute, or as the price of a dog, or an animal born of a mixture of diverse kinds, or an animal that is a treifa, or an animal born by cesarean section. The verse therefore states this to exclude these animals from the law. So any error that the priests made will disqualify the offering, and it should not go up on the altar if it's an olah. But if it did go up, we don't take it down, according to Rabbi Shimon, no matter what the mistake of the priest was. However, if the animal itself is fully disqualified because it was used in bestiality or any of these other things, then even if it was placed on the altar, we take it off. The Gemara asks, and what did you see as the reason to include the former cases and to exclude the latter ones? And the Gemara responds, I include these former cases whose disqualification occurred in sanctity, i.e. in the course of the temple service, and I exclude these latter cases whose disqualification did not occur in sanctity, meaning that they were disqualified as offerings from the outset. That animal should have never been brought into the temple to be used as an offering for the reasons listed. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak continues, in any event, the Baraisa teaches that if one placed the blood that is to be placed below the red line above it, or if one placed the blood that is to be placed above the red line below it, the offering does not descend from the altar. All agree about that. And Rabbi Yehuda does not disagree, even though he holds that if the blood spilled on the ground, the offering descends from the altar. And what is the reason for this? Is it not because even if the blood was misapplied, the altar has absorbed the blood, and it is not considered to have been spilled on the floor? So conclude from it that if the blood was misapplied on the altar, the priest may not gather it up again in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Back to the question we asked 20 minutes ago, or 10 minutes ago, why not, if it's misapplied on the altar, don't we just take some blood, back and then apply it in the right location? Answer, because the altar was made of stone, and stone absorbs liquid, right? And so some of that blood that was applied in the wrong place is done, right? The altar already absorbed that blood. It's too late for the redo. Pursuant to the discussion of disqualified offerings that do not descend from the external altar, right, the main altar, Rabbi Eliezer says the inner altar, i.e. the golden incense altar inside the sanctuary, does sanctify disqualified offerings such that if they ascended onto it, they do not descend. What? What's our problem there? The inner altar is much smaller than the external altar, and it is used for incense. Blood gets sprinkled on it on Yom Kippur. Other than that, only incense is burned on it. What are you talking about? Disqualified offerings that ascend to it? Are we talking about disqualified incense? Or are we talking about that the priest was so spaced out that he brought meat and placed it on the incense altar? Let's keep reading. The Gemara asks, what is this statement teaching us? We already learned this in the above Baraisa. If one placed the blood that is to be placed inside the sanctuary, outside the external altar, if one placed the blood that is to be placed outside the sanctuary, inside the golden altar, the offering does not descend. Right? I guess what they're saying is, even though you sprinkled on the inner altar, if you at the same time put the meat up on the external altar for burning, you're not going to take it off because the sprinkling was done in the wrong location. So the Gemara responds, if one were to learn the law only from there, I would say this matter applies only to blood mistakenly placed on the golden altar, as it is fit to be placed on that altar in certain contexts, i.e. the blood of the bull and the goat sin offerings on Yom Kippur. But with regard to a handful from a meal offering, right, which remember the priest does with those middle three fingers, takes the fine flour when he's making a meal offering, which is not fit to be placed on the golden altar in any context, I will say that it is not sanctified if erroneously it was placed on the golden altar. So Rabbi Eliezer therefore teaches us that even a handful from a meal offering does not descend from it, right? According to this view of Rabbi Eliezer, if the meal offering was placed on the golden altar, it shouldn't have happened, but now that it did happen, we don't take it off. The Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa. If a strange incense, i.e. incense that is prohibited to burn on the golden altar, ascended onto the altar, it shall descend. We don't allow strange incense on the golden altar. That may well be what killed Nadav and Avihu in the wilderness, in the Midbar, the sons of Aaron, who brought a strange fire unto the Lord, and then they died. So if one brings a strange incense onto the golden altar, it shall descend. We take it off. As only the external altar sanctifies disqualified offerings that are suited for it, one can infer that the external altar does sanctify disqualified offerings, like the case of an olah where it goes up and we don't take it down, but the inner altar does not. So if something wrong placed there, we should take it off. And the Gemara responds, answer like this. The Baraisa means that if strange incense ascended onto the external altar, it shall descend, as the external altar sanctifies only disqualified offerings that are suited for it. We don't put incense on the external altar, and we don't put meat on the inner altar. But the inner altar sanctifies everything, whether it is suited for it or not suited for it. And what is the reason for this? The external altar, is considered part of the floor, since it is fixed to the floor of the temple. And that, the inner altar, is considered a service vessel with a higher level of sanctity. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 2. We move on to Mishnah 4. With regard to one who slaughters the offering with intent to sprinkle its blood outside the temple, right? So we've talked about having intent to put the sprinkling in the wrong place on the altar, okay? And we've talked about having intent to eat the meat beyond its allotted time, okay? These would disqualify the offering. Or intent to sprinkle beyond its allotted time, etc. Now we're talking about a different kind of inappropriate intent by the one who is slaughtering the offering, that at the time of slaughter, he has in mind that the sprinkling will be done not only on the wrong part of the altar, not only not on the altar, but in fact outside the temple entirely. Okay? Obviously prohibited, inappropriate. What's going to be the consequence? With regard to one who slaughters the offering and has in mind, has intent to sprinkle its blood outside the temple, or to sprinkle part of its blood outside the temple, or to burn its sacrificial portions outside the temple instead of on the altar, or to burn part of its sacrificial portions outside the temple, to partake of its meat outside the temple. That must be the meat of a sin offering, because that has to be eaten inside the temple by priests, as opposed to a peace offering, which parts of it are eaten outside the temple. Or to partake of an olive bulk of its meat outside the temple, even a little bit. Or to partake of an olive bulk of the skin of the tail outside the temple. In all these cases, the offering is disqualified. And there is no liability for kares for one who partakes of it, right? So it's not rendered pigul, in which case if one ate of it, he would have kares. So this means that the meat will not be permitted for consumption because you had intent to do something outside the temple that should have been done inside the temple. But if you then violate the prohibition and eat of it anyway, or place it on the altar anyway, you violated a prohibition. You could be subject to lashes, but not to kares, not death at the hands of him. But if one had intent at the time of slaughter to sprinkle its blood the next day, right? So normally we think pigul is having intent at the time of slaughter to eat the meat beyond the permitted time to eat the meat. Now we're going to find out that pigul also applies to one who had intent to sprinkle the blood beyond the time, the deadline for sprinkling the blood. So, but if one had intent to sprinkle its blood the next day, or part of its blood the next day, to burn its sacrificial portions the next day, or to burn part of the sacrificial portions the next day, to partake of its meat the next day, or to partake of an olive bulk of its meat the next day, or to partake an olive bulk, to partake of an olive bulk of the skin of the tail the next day, in all these cases, as opposed to having an inappropriate intent in space, to eat this stuff outside the temple. Now he has inappropriate intent in time, not only with respect to eating, but also with respect to sprinkling or burning sacrificial portions beyond the allotted time. In all these cases, the offering is pigul. And one is liable to receive kares if he burns it on the altar or eats of it knowingly. That's Mishnah 4. Now the Gemara. The students assumed that the skin of the tail, now we're at the top of 28a, getting a little bit of a head start on the next page because we had a head start. So the students assumed that the skin of the tail is considered as though it were part of the tail itself. The tail of a sheep, sacrificed as a peace offering, is burned on the altar rather than eaten. So you should not, if you have an intent to eat it, that's a problem. But if so, one who slaughters the sheep with intent to consume the skin of its tail the next day has intent to shift its consumption from consumption by the altar, i.e. burning the offering, to consumption by a person. Since intent to consume part of an offering beyond its designated time renders an offering pigul only if that part is intended for human consumption, why does the Mishnah rule that such an offering is pigul? Right, as we saw before, pigul only applies when everything else was done properly, and then something that would have been permitted to eat, you had intent to eat it beyond its allotted time, then it becomes pigul. But if you're talking about that you had intent to eat beyond its allotted time, something that wasn't permitted to eat anyway, because it was supposed to be consumed on the altar, why does pigul apply? So Shmuel says, in accordance with whose opinion is this? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says, one can have intent to shift an item's consumption from consumption by the altar to consumption by a person, or from consumption by a person to consumption by the altar, and the offering will still be rendered pigul, because according to Shmuel in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, since it's still going to be consumed, whether by the altar or by a person, even though you shifted it to the wrong type of consumption, it's still consumption, and therefore pigul can still apply. This is as we learned in the Mishna on page 35a. In a case of one who slaughters the offering with intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not partake of it, or to burn an item whose typical manner is that one does not burn it on the altar, and he has intent beyond its designated time or outside its designated area, the offering is fit, and Rabbi Eliezer deems it unfit, right? So according to the first view, the majority view, it seems, if you had, you developed this pigul intent about something that wasn't available for eating anyway, then you didn't do anything, right? Whereas Rabbi Eliezer makes it unfit because you had a pigul intent, even though it was about something you shouldn't have done in the first place. So the Gemara asks, right? Let me just read that again. One who slaughters the offering with intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not partake, right? So he makes two mistakes. In fact, actually, I'm sorry. Right now, we're not talking about pigul, right? So the point is that if you have an intent to eat from a burnt offering, which is supposed to only be consumed by the altar, but you're going to plan to eat it, not outside its designated time, just the fact that you have intent to eat it at all. Now, what are you doing? You're not supposed to eat of a burnt offering. It's supposed to be entirely consumed by the altar. So if you have intent that you're going to eat from that, erroneous intent, did you disqualify it? The majority view is no, because it was never meant for you. If you then go ahead and eat it before it goes up on the altar, then you're going to create a problem. But your intent is a nonsense intent, and therefore didn't render it unfit. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, that's another example of a mistaken, inappropriate intent that would render it unfit. So the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did you interpret the Mishnah here? You interpreted it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Where now we're going to mix this other kind of disqualifying intent to eat something that shouldn't be eaten with, and to do that eating beyond the allotted time where it should have been burned, right? Where pigul would apply, right? So if you can render it unfit, does that mean that pigul does or doesn't apply, right? So the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did you interpret the Mishnah here? You interpreted it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that intending to eat something which should have been burned would render it unfit. But if so, say that the latter clause, i.e. the next Mishnah on page 29b, that our next Mishnah, this is the principle: anyone who slaughters the animal, or who collects the blood, or who conveys the blood, or who sprinkles the blood, and in any of these stages, he has intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one partakes of it, or to burn an item whose typical manner is that one burns it on the altar. So he has correct intent in terms of what kind of offering he's bringing, but he's intending to do that beyond its designated time, whether to eat it beyond its designated time or to burn it beyond its designated time. He has rendered it pigul. And the consequence of pigul is, if he then does eat of it, then it's a karas-bearing penalty. So one can infer that intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one partakes of it does render it pigul if you have intent to do that beyond the allotted time. And the implication is that while intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one does not partake of it, right? Therefore, if you're intending to eat something that is normally burned on the altar, and you're intending to eat it beyond the allotted time when it should have been burned, you will not render it pigul. In this clause, we arrive at the opinion of the rabbis, the majority, who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer. So can it be that the first clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, while the latter clause is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis? And Shmuel said to him, yeah, yes, it can be. This is how one must understand the Mishnah. Rav Huna says the skin of the tail, right? The skin of the tail. What are we talking about? The skin of the tail. The skin of the tail gets burned, right? Not eaten in an ola. So Rav Huna says the skin of the tail is not considered as though it were the tail itself. Unlike the tail itself, its skin is consumed. So consequently, both this Mishnah and the next can be understood in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Rava said, what is the reasoning of Rav Huna? As the verse states, and he shall present of the sacrifice of peace offerings an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat thereof, the fat tail, indicating that the priest must offer the fat of the tail on the altar, but not the skin of the tail, right? Peace offering you eat, but you don't eat the tail. The tail goes up on the altar. Elevation offering, an ola, all of it goes on the altar. In a peace offering, the owner eats the animal, but not the tail. So is the skin of the tail part of the tail or not part of the tail? Rav Chisda says, actually, the skin of the tail is considered as though it were the tail itself, and it is burned on the altar. And here in the Mishnah, we are dealing with the tail of a kid goat, which is not burned on the altar, but is consumed. Only the tail of a sheep is not consumed. So accordingly, intent to consume it outside the designated time would render it pigul. And the Gemara notes all of them, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, do not say, as Shmuel says, since they do not wish to interpret that the first clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer and the latter clause is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. And Shmuel and Rav Chisda do not say, as Rav Huna says, since they heard that the skin of the tail is considered as though it were the tail itself. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason that Shmuel and Rav Huna do not say, as Rav Chisda says, that the Mishnah is referring to the tail of a kid? The Gemara responds that they reason, according to Rav Chisda, what is the Mishnah teaching us? By referring specifically to the skin of the tail, does it mean to teach simply that the skin of the tail is considered edible, like the tail itself? We already learned that in another Mishnah, Tractate Chulin, page 122a. These are the entities whose skin has a legal status like that of their meat, since it is soft and edible. Which one? The skin beneath the tail. And the Gemara asks, and Rav Chisda, how would he respond? Well, the Gemara answers the reference here is to the skin of the tail. The reference here to the skin of the tail was necessary. As given only the Mishna and tractate Hulin, it might enter your mind to say that this matter, the equation between the skin of the tail and the tail itself, applies only with regard to the matter of Tuma, as the skin of the tail is soft and edible and is therefore counted as part of the tail and not counted as leather, right? Which would have a different status. But here, with regard to the matter of the temple service, I will say that the verse states with regard to the gifts to which members of the priesthood are entitled as a consecrated portion in Numbers 18:8 to indicate that they must be eaten in greatness, in the way that kings eat. And since kings do not generally eat the skin of the tail, I will say that it is not considered an eaten portion of the offering. The Mishnah therefore teaches us that it is nevertheless considered like the tail itself. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa. One who slaughters a burnt offering with intent to burn an olive bulk of the skin beneath the tail outside its designated area renders the offering disqualified, but there's no liability for kares for one who partakes of the offering. So if his intent is to burn beyond its designated time, it is rendered pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for eating it. This is the opinion of the rabbis. Elazar ben Yehuda of Avelim says in the name of Rabbi Yaakov, and so Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda of Kfar Ikos would say in the name of Rabbi Shimon, whether the hide of the hooves of small livestock, or the skin of the head of a young calf, or the skin beneath the tail, or any of the skins that the sages listed with regard to Tuma, under the heading, these are the entities whose skin has a halachic status like that of their meat, which means to include the skin of the womb. If one has intent to burn one of them outside its designated area, the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. And if one's intent is to burn it beyond its designated time, as opposed to outside of its designated place, then he does render it pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for eating or partaking of it, right? So the point here is because they said skin, we have to analyze, well, is skin equivalent to meat or not? We know what the answer would be with respect to meat. If he had intent, right, to burn or consume some of that meat in a place where it's not meant to be consumed, then he would disqualify the offering, but then one who violated that prohibition on eating that disqualified meat would not receive kares because the error, right, the mistaken intent was with respect to place. Whereas when there's an error with respect to time, it is rendered pigul, and then if one violated the prohibition by eating that which he wasn't supposed to eat because it was pigul, and he did that intentionally, he would be liable to kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court. One can infer from the Baraisa that only with regard to a burnt offering, yes, the skin of the tail is burned on the altar like the tail itself. But with regard to another offering, that is not the law. Granted, according to Rav Huna, who holds that the skin of the tail of a peace offering is not considered as though it were the tail itself, and it is eaten rather than burned, this is the reason that the Tana teaches us about the burnt offering specifically, as all portions of a burnt offering are burned, even those that are eaten in the case of other offerings. But according to Rav Chizda, who holds that the skin of the tail is burned together with the tail, why does the Tana specifically teach about a burnt offering? If the skin of the tail is always considered as though we're part of the tail itself, let the Tana teach about any offering, right, where the skin of the tail would be considered like the meat. He should have just talked about the meat. So Rav Chizda could have said to you, if you wish, say that the Baraisa is referring to the tail of a kid, which is never burned on the altar except in the case of a burnt offering. And if you wish, say instead that one should amend the text of the Baraisa to teach one who slaughters any offering, etc. That's what I've got today. And I'm seeing no questions or comments. So let us rejoice in the return of the hostages. And someone is asking about the hours. So no class tomorrow, Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah in Israel. No class Wednesday, because that's Simchas Torah here in the United States and outside, everywhere outside of Israel. So no class Tuesday and Wednesday. And we will resume with a regular class time on Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. All the best. Hag Sameach. And may we go from strength to strength, joy to joy, and gratitude to gratitude. Hag Sameach.